you come to some conclusion on a trip, it must be true, or like Mama Ayahuasca told me this, it must be true, or this shaman gave me an ecstatic experience, they must be a really noble, virtuous person. This kind of naivety. So one of the longer term missions, I guess, is like improving ecstatic literacy in Western culture.
Welcome to Psychedelic Source, where wisdom meets practice in the evolving landscape of psychedelic medicine. I'm your host, Dr. Sandra Dreisbach, and I'm here to help you navigate the complex intersection of ethics, business, and personal growth in the psychedelic space. Whether you're a practitioner, therapist, entrepreneur, or simply curious about this transformative field, you've found your source for authentic dialogue, practical resources, and community connection. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the stories, strategies, and ethical considerations that matter most to our growing ecosystem. Let's tap in to our inner source of wisdom and explore what it means to build a sustainable and ethical psychedelic future together.
The information shared on this podcast, our website, and other platforms may be triggering for some viewers and readers and is for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only. It is not a substitute for professional medical, legal, or therapeutic advice. While we explore topics related to altered states of consciousness, we do not endorse or encourage illegal activities or substance use. Always research your local laws and consult qualified professionals for guidance. The content provided is, as is, and we are not liable for any actions taken based on the information shared. Stay supported and informed, act responsibly, and enjoy the podcast.
In this episode, I had the opportunity to talk with Julian Evans, who does work with the Challenging Experiences Project that he helped to found and is the director of, which I encourage you to look at the site as a resource, as well as giving insights on challenging experiences. Also, his work on ecstatic integration to help understand the sort of larger picture of psychedelic and ecstatic experiences in general, right? If we don't just categorize altered states as just simply being a product of a plant medicine or a psychedelic, synthetic, natural, or otherwise, we look at it in terms of how it shifts our consciousness, how we have the experience of what he calls the ecstatic or altered states or a shift in our conscious reality that needs a different support, a different understanding, and we need to have a better understanding in our culture, a better education in our culture about how to support these ecstatic experiences and both the positive realities as well as the challenging realities that are part of the risk profile, you could say, if we really want to increase the positive results and reduce the potential harms in a grounded way. That I hope you see also the need for greater education and resourcing in order to do that work safely and more supported. And regardless of where you feel or the type of experience or how that experience is supported, that you're at least open to the possibility of the needs that are not currently yet being met. And working together, collaborating, helps to provide the sourcing we all need to have not just a safer experience, but a better experience in our lives that integrate any type of ecstatic experience. Well, welcome, Jules. It's so great to see you. I mean, honestly, I'm so tickled pink just to have you here. I mean, I'm happy with everyone I have on the podcast, but I'm particularly pleased to have you because, I mean, you've done so much amazing work around ethics in this space through your journalism. And though I've given a little bit of introduction in terms of your bio, would you mind saying a little bit about, your work in this space?
Yeah, sure. So thank you for having me, Sandra. So I started something called the Challenging Psychedelic Experiences Project 2 years ago, which one of the things it does is researches difficulties people experience after taking psychedelics, what kind of difficulties and what helps them recover. We also run a peer support group for people who cope with these kinds of post-psychedelic difficulties. We do talks and presentations and training around this. Um, yeah, all kinds of stuff. So we produced about 9 academic papers, maybe 8. I haven't counted them exactly, but
Goodness.
and and I
More than I've
started
done.
yeah, and then I started a newsletter at the same time, which is called Ecstatic Integration, and that has produced a lot of stories over the last 2.5 years, particularly about psychedelics. Some stories about psychedelic harm and misconduct or safety, but it's called ecstatic integration because it's about how do we reintegrate ecstatic experiences into Western culture, like relatively wisely and relatively safely.
And what's your own answer to that question?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, it's a big question,
It is a big
and
question. I mean,
it'll take decades or
no,
centuries.
sure. But I mean, it's worth mentioning, right? As a trained philosopher, my little mindset about questions, right? Some of these questions are open-ended that we explore and we engage in, and it's partly realizing the importance of directly addressing it, and just like us having the conversation about it. It's like, well, what does that really mean?
Well, one thing I think there's a lot of naivety around ecstatic experiences, like that people are they're kind of there's been a revival of ecstatic practices like psychedelics and other kinds of things, and there's a lot of interest in them and kind of hunger for them, and to some extent kind of a greediness around them and a fetishization around them, and
Definitely.
naivety as well. Like, you come to some conclusion on a trip, it must be true, or like Mama Ayahuasca told me this, it must be true, or this shaman gave me an ecstatic experience, they must be a really noble, virtuous person. These kinds of this kind of naivety. So one of the longer term kind of goals, or at least missions, I guess, is like improving ecstatic literacy in Western culture.
I
So
I love
discernment.
that idea of ecstatic literacy, because I think about this work, like having that basic understanding of what exactly is a consciousness altering experience, a psychedelic experience, or as you say, an ecstatic experience, and and what do we as a sort of global North, Western, colonial primarily culture, how do we approach these subjects given that we don't have that relationship already established in our culture? If anything, we've actually, killed it, and trying to revive it in particular ways. So how do you feel for yourself? How do you answer and come to relationship with that question? Right? I mean, obviously you think it's an important question, but given it's going to be a process of figuring out what ecstatic literacy is, right? What for you has helped to establish your ecstatic literacy?
Pain, suffering, time. Yeah, you-
You're
you-
you're very pretty
you-
picture. And
this
maybe we should
really
give background. Maybe we should give some.
kind of, the slow grind of existence.
Okay,
Yeah,
now we're talking existential dread here. Where am I
like
animal?
that's it. Like, just life, right? I mean, like,
Right,
uh, having highs and lows, and realize, and having, ecstatic experiences and realizing they're not the everything, and that you come down after them, and
right,
and feel, being let down by guru figures, or messing up yourself, all these kinds of things. So, um, yeah, and so, there can be, I think there can be like ecstatic moments in Western culture. Let's talk about psychedelics as well, like this kind of ecstatic highs in the psychedelic movement, and then there are times of disenchantment and criticism and even paranoia, and so there's a balance, like, between, oh my god, the universe is on our side, and we're gonna save humanity, to this is all crap. So so there, and I think the psychedelic culture is trying to find that balance. between like kind of excessive hype and excessive disenchantment. So that's, I suppose, kind of ecstatic literacy. Like, also, I think being a bit wary of utopianism, ecstatic utopianism. Um, there's waves of ecstatic utopianism over the centuries.
Yeah. And how would you define utopianism, psychedelic utopianism? Like that we're gonna make the world a better place just by having these experiences, right? Or that we're gonna wake the global consciousness.
I mean, there's different levels of utopianism. Like, humanity is going to transcend to a new level, a new evolutionary level through psychedelics. I mean, that's utopianism. Like, we're going to become a different species, or we're going to ascend to some kind of cosmic consciousness. That's utopianism, right? Or apocalypticism, like a new age of love will dawn, or all divisions will be dissolved, we'll all become, oneness, an age of Aquarius, a massive paradigm shift. I mean, these are all kinds of beliefs one finds in New Age culture and psychedelic culture, including among psychedelic leaders. Like, psychedelic drugs are going to be what's going to solve the environmental crisis, all these kinds of things. I don't
Yeah.
think I don't think that's true. But they might help some people. Like, I
Yeah.
have
Yeah,
very
I think that's the interesting contrast, right? There's part of the experience on a personal level that really is that really creates this sort of shift in perspective that may not have been able to be accomplished in other ways, or possibly it would have been, but that's how they got it, right? That's how they got the shift in perspective, that mindset shift. And or at least opened up from, like, let's say pure nihilism, I'm just going to die and everything's worthless, to like maybe like there's actually real hope in the world. Or the opposite. Oh, there's totally hope and utopian idealism, and then having that grounded, like, oh, I'm now looking at my darkest parts of my life experience that I never wanted to look at.
yeah, exactly.
And so it makes me wanna, maybe we should bridge to the idea of a challenging experience, 'cause I feel like you've been the biggest proponent of that part of the education, of
Yeah.
understanding that, because there's a lot of conversation about ego deaths as part of the experience, or or that there's no it's just a difficult experience versus a challenging experience, and I also wanna, like, actually a harmful experience. I think there's a lot of nuance that's missing in the language of this, and challenging can be a good challenge versus, more of a challenge of the self, but how do you generally kinda define, for yourself at least, what a challenging experience is?
Uh, just the, I mean, we're not. My project is called the Challenging Psychedelic Experiences Project. What it really looks at is post-psychedelic difficulties. I'm not. People have trips that are often extremely gnarly, terrifying, but they feel
Definitely.
none the worse for it afterwards.
Right.
Um, because these are experiences of like ego death, like you said, or people might feel they're in hell, or confronting entities, perhaps that seem malevolent to them, all kinds of things. So people can have psychedelic experiences that they classify as the most difficult experience of their life, or one of the top five. That's quite common. Um, but a lot of people then they come down and they're like, "Wow, that was one hell of an experience," and they don't feel any worse for it. But and so that's not an issue. That's not a problem. Um, but my concern is when people feel worse afterwards for an extended period of time. That's the problem. Or like, something bad happens to them during the trip. But I
Right.
mean, I guess I'm particularly focused on the research that we do is particularly focused on what we call extended difficulties. So we did a survey in 2023 of, we asked, it was basically 608 people who all said they'd experienced difficulties after psychedelics lasting longer than a day. So that was our data set. Everyone, these were people, and we asked them, how long did these difficulties last? Some it was just days, some it was weeks, but a third of this data set said their difficulties lasted longer than a year, and a fifth said their difficulties lasted longer than 3 years. And then we asked what kind of difficulties did they experience, it's to get just a kind of sense of the landscape. What kind of
Landscape.
what do
Yes,
people
exactly.
thought? Yeah. And so, the most common we got 60 different types. So there's all kinds of that's one point, I guess. Like there's all kinds of stuff that can happen, from visions of childhood abuse that you never really remembered and you're not sure if they're true. So that sometimes happens to people. Or, you had a hell experience and then you're afraid of going back to that hell experience,
Right.
either on psychedelics or when you sleep or when you die. Or I mean, just there's all there's a whole variety of strange things that can happen and that can carry on afterwards. But the most common were just first of all feeling more anxiety and fear and just shaken up and sometimes severe anxiety. And then visual distortions. A lot of people feel continued visual distortions afterwards. Many people aren't disturbed by that, but some people find it really disturbing, and sometimes it lasts years and years. Then derealization and depersonalization was reported by about 12% of our respondents. That's not 12% of everyone who takes psychedelics. That's
It's just
just it.
the ones the neuroscope of the
Our
people who
data set.
experienced, yeah,
Exactly.
of the data set. Yeah.
And then other difficulties like existential confusion, like what the hell was that? I can't make sense of it. I can't stop thinking about it. I just can't integrate that experience into my worldview.
Right.
And then other ones were like sleep disturbances and also like feeling of a diminished self, like just feeling you're less of a person or broken or damaged and you can't, and that's very tough to accept. So those were some of the most common kinds of difficulties.
Yeah, and I think that's really helpful to kind of see and lay out because I think there hasn't been much research on this aspect of the psychedelic experience and with a lot of the sort of psychedelic exceptionalism, right, that's out there, having that sort of grounded approach, while still, and maybe I should get you on the record for saying like, well, given all this, what would you say, would have prevented a lot of these? Or do you think in general that some of them cannot be prevented?
There's another paper by someone called Rebecca Bremler, which looked at extended difficulties, and she hypothesized that they're more likely to happen with certain kind of characteristics, like
Of the
young,
person? Of the
yeah,
person.
the
Yeah, okay.
person in the situation. So a younger person is more likely to be overwhelmed by the experience and kind of traumatized by it. That's also true if it's a higher dose, or I suppose if there's multiple drugs involved. If it's a bad setting,
Right.
or just a inconducive setting, if they have a previous psychological problems or psychiatric diagnosis. Um, yeah. And then I suppose also the situation they go back to after the experience. Is it extremely stressful and or maybe they're going back and the people around them have no familiarity with psychedelics, or they just don't feel they have anyone they can talk to about it. So their kind of support system can make a difference.
Yeah, and I definitely feel like a support system makes a difference. It's something I would agree that I've seen that a lot of people don't have those communities already, or the communities that they have may or may not be supportive of their experiences. Let alone the ideas and concepts like that literacy aspect of like integration. I know that there's that study. I wish I could cite it. Maybe no, the one where they're looking at people who've had adverse events and they went to the emergency room, and some theoretical ideas about maybe integration might have been supportive and preventative if they had that. And maybe this is an argument for the literacy piece. What is your hope in the end that people will learn? What kind of skills or understandings do you think people need before they engage? I'm guessing you're not against psychedelic experiences, but more about having a real knowing or understanding or being prepared.
Yeah, well, I think there's quite a lot out there about how to trip well. and the kind of guides to tripping. So there's all kinds of guides to that around, isn't there? I think psychedelic culture is always telling people how to trip well. What it wasn't doing was telling them what the fuck to do if it goes badly. Because
Yeah.
they're like, well, it doesn't go badly. Like it
Right.
never goes
Right.
bad, or if it does, it's kind of your fault. And
Right.
if it goes badly, you should just listen to the medicine.
Or go back and do more shadow work. Right.
Don't resist or do shadow work. Yeah. And so we focused on just providing information for people. What if they found themselves in that situation, that they could find their way to our website and find information on post psychedelic difficulties and realize they're not alone. So that's our focus, more on how to trip well. Like, yeah, but I mean, that's important too. Like, try to know your dose, go slow, trip with friends, or, maybe with someone who's not on psychedelics, all those things which you know about.
Yeah. No, right. I mean, but I appreciate the fact that let's give people a realistic picture, right?
Well, we're trying to help people once they're in that place, like,
Yeah.
like that, just that people who are like messed up after psychedelics, they feel terrible, they're terrified, and like they want information about what's going on with them. So like there needs to be places, and there aren't places
That's right.
where they can find information like that. I think there are hardly any. I think our website is one of the few places where they can find information. They won't find that anywhere else. All these psychedelic websites won't mention these symptoms. So they're on their own, and that's very frightening.
Yeah. So what would you recommend someone if they do have a challenging experience? You would say like go to our site and you can see that you're not alone in this experience.
I don't know. It depends. If a lot of people have a challenging experience, they won't feel worse afterwards. So woohoo, go on with your life. I'm saying if they have extended difficulties, then yeah, come to our website, and there's information about what kind of difficulties people experience, what helps people recover from these difficulties, stories of people who've been through difficulties and come out the other side, peer support, references for like expert clinics where they can go to and get free consultations from like experts on post psychedelic difficulties, this kind of stuff. Yeah, and basically their life isn't over. People come through these things. They're no fun. They're extremely unpleasant to go through, or can be. But people do come through them.
And I think that's an optimistic message for people and to know that I mean, even though they may feel temporarily crazy. I mean, literally, psychosis is one of the adverse. There can be ways of working through those experiences, even in the most extreme cases, and there's others who have those experiences. Well, let's pivot now to talk about more around ethics, because I know I have to say that I'll confess I'm a fan. And I think I know maybe I'm biased because I care about ethics, but you're reporting in the space and sharing so many of the stories that I think people really want and need to hear, and have shared more publicly. I think it's one of the things I really admire about you and your work, even beyond like just the challenging experiences alone is admirable, to be honest, right? And the ecstatic integration. But I think a lot of times you give voice to a lot of these ethical issues that aren't getting voiced other ways.
Well, likewise,
Oh, thank you.
Sandra. Like,
Yeah.
so I imagine, yeah, both you and I get approached by people who feel like harmed in some way
Yeah.
and don't feel they have many options about where to go, and feel that they're in a psychedelic culture which doesn't really encourage um, people to talk about, problems, either adverse experiences or harm. There's a culture of silence, isn't there?
Well, I mean, or worse, like there really isn't a good. I mean, similar to like the idea of having a conversation or literacy around ecstatic integration, there isn't literacy around what is accountability supposed to look like, right? When because ethical ethical challenges are a human experience in my book, right? Like that's not and just the risks um and the benefits are more significant with psychedelic experiences. And the cancel culture sort of approach or whistleblowing to the extreme, I think in some sense can I mean, I'm not an advocate of those approaches on the whole, but I do believe that there are times when you need to, right? Because if there's no means to share it, or there's no practice, or people are all underground, which is why I appreciate you sharing some of these stories. I know I'm sure you get a lot of criticism though too for sharing these, like, that I
Yeah, I do. Yeah. Yeah, I have. It's been very stressful. And I think when I started the newsletter, I was learning about psychedelic culture, and I found it fascinating. I was like, "Whoa, this what freaky stuff!" And there was a kind of what a mess. And there it was, but there was a bit of a fascination to it as well. I was like, "Wow, this stuff's going on." And now, when people get in touch and say, "I want to talk to you about a situation," I'm like, "Oh, you sure? Really, you want to talk to me? Like, like." There's no longer. I'm now familiar with psychedelic culture, and I know about all this kind of how messy it is. And I no longer this is no longer piquing my curiosity. Now it's just like, oh well, yeah,
feel like there are now healthy boundaries.
yeah. Well, I say, listen, I may, I can refer you to another journalist, maybe, because will do that sometimes. But um, I think you're right that going public is when other things have failed. When, I spoke to someone this today who worked at a retreat center, and there were various issues there. They tried to get the retreat center owner to improve these issues repeatedly, and it didn't happen. And now they're like, well, what, they left, and they're like, they still feel this shouldn't be going on. So what are their options? And so they're looking at mm, going public about it. And so there's been a failure of other options. And and I'm interested in other options, because I know that going public is stressful kind of for everyone. It's very
Absolutely,
stressful for the
no
person
doubt.
who's reported on. It's the stressful for the whistleblower. It's stressful for the journalist. um And so, it would be better if mediation was possible. And I said to this person, "Do you think this retreat owner would be open to mediation?" And this person said, "No, I tried that repeatedly." Um, as you know, there aren't really official ombudsmans or complaints procedures in the psychedelic underground, or even in the overground,
That's right.
in terms of retreat centers. But I mean, I did an article last week about the breathwork industry, where there are associations, and they have integrity committees, and they have, restorative justice procedures, which they've tried for some like high profile um
Well, and it's happened in psychedelic
misbehaving
space. We've had
facilitators.
some restorative justice attempts in the psychedelic space.
Right. Well, I'm curious about that. And it's because we have, mutual friend Erica Siegel, and she
Yes,
mentioned that there have been I don't really hear about them, because by the time they come to me, they
it's failed,
it's
probably.
failed.
Yeah, it's
But,
failed.
but
Yeah, and they're
I'm
talking
curious.
about lawyers at that point, right? Yeah.
I'm curious. Has it worked then? Sometimes.
Um, I'm not an expert in restorative justice. And I have healthy pragmatic experience where I've seen the limitations of that, because you need everyone to be willing to be involved. Right? Even if the people who have been harmed, want the process and are requesting the other person who they see as having harmed them, or multiple persons or organization or community, they can still say no. Or or they do the look of it. They hire the company or organization. I could name names, but they've hired people. They bring people in that they've chosen, And then people don't trust the process in part, or they don't have the necessary skills to deal with this scope of problem. Um, and unfortunately, I've seen more instances of failure of restorative justice than I've seen successes. And in the moments where I could say that there were some limited success, it's a long process, and it takes money, time, heart, energy, and all the work. At least, like, I mean, Epic doesn't try and be restorative justice. We mainly empower people to make their own decisions. But even us, we came together in part originally to help with possibly doing reporting, and immediately saw the limitations of the systems in place. That said, I think mediation could be a solution in conflict resolution, and that's kind of the angle we're pushing people towards now, which could include restorative justice if people agree, right? But getting people in a process where they're trying to come to an agreement, where they have support,
So
because
what is the broader thing that includes restorative justice? I missed a bit of the sentence. You said
no, I mean mediation,
sorry,
conflict resolution.
mediation, conflict resolution.
Yeah, which conflict
Where's my go
resolution
to
and
for that?
mediation, like, yeah, I mean, and different than having a legal mediator, although you could have a legal mediator. But I think we need and I think as a culture, we need better ways of resolving conflicts than, go talk to my lawyer. And honestly, more times than not, what I've seen in the psychedelic space, that's what it is. You know, um, an organization I can think of where they're like, "Oh, here's our process," but then when you look closer at the process, it's the lawyer, right? And they have the name of like an ethics whatever, but they're not really focused on that. They're protecting the legal interest of the company and the organization, and they're not and often the survivors are not in a position to have that legal support, let alone getting therapeutic support, let alone having support for their own well-being if they can no longer function in their job because of they've experienced. Uh, and I don't think that's limited to psychedelic space, but I
Mm.
think there's
I
a
mean, I can't, I, I can't see myself continuing to report on like psychedelic scandals for like another year or two. It's just like, it's too taxing. I'll happily let someone else do it, as others do, and you see that. I think it's cyclical, right? Like you see like certain journalists write about things a lot and then they go and do something else, because and write about like, you know, animals or something.
I've read about unicorns for
Oh,
a while, people.
Jupiter or something like that, or something less controversial.
But
Yeah.
I mean, but I think, and this is the other thing I think, maybe we can uniquely highlight is like what it takes for us to do the work that we do, right? Because what people don't see is the personal demands, right? The
Yeah. Well, also,
practices.
like, yeah, and let's not, I'm not going to pretend that I'm impeccable and spotless.
No,
Like,
no, neither will
you're
I.
working with, I've messed up, like, and then you feel absolutely terrible, like, um, in terms of you're working with very sensitive, vulnerable people sometimes, and you might get something wrong, or just be clumsy or careless in some way, and then you've made them feel worse, so it is hard. And also with journalism, yeah, you can be unfair. I mean, or just like not go the you try to be balanced, or to be fair. I think that's true with a lot of journalism. Is you're kind of, one side is talking to you, so you're gonna listen to that side, and the other side might be not talking to you, and you're gonna be like, well, you're in the wrong here. I mean, so be yeah, so it's very, it's no fun. It's
Well, it's
like,
challenging. Talk about challenging experiences, right? But I will say I think you have consistently shown up over a longer period of time, even if you do mix in other stories. Maybe we could shift gears and talk about like how did you even get interested in the psychedelic space personally?
um, I was into psychedelics as a teenager. I first trip when I was like 15, and my most intense period of drug taking was as a teenager. And then I had a bad trip when I was 18, and didn't have the capacity to deal with it then or afterwards. Like, emotionally, in terms of wisdom and so on, in terms of age or anything like that, or in terms of the support around me. And so at university, I developed mental health problems like the severe anxiety and blah blah blah, and ended up being diagnosed with PTSD when I was about 23, 24. And it took me years to recover, all through my 20s, really. Um, and that decided my life path, really. Maybe I had always gone down the same path, but I became interested in mental health, philosophy, spirituality, psychology, and writing about it. It was always wanted to be a writer. And so I was a business journalist first, but then when I was around 30, I started writing about philosophy, mental health, all that kind of stuff. My first book was about the ancient philosophy of Stoicism, which is one of the things that really helped me recover from this kind of post-psychedelic crisis. And then when I was talk about philosophy, like when I was at university, one of my favorite books I was obsessed by was Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy. He talks about the kind of the Socratic and the Dionysiac. And I wrote this first book, Philosophy for Life and Other Dangerous Situations, all about the Socratic, about using your reason and Greek philosophy to flourish. But at the end of the book, I said, but of course, there is another way to flourishing, which is not about reason, but about surrendering control and going beyond rationality, the Dionysiac. So I was kind of teeing up, my
Yeah,
second book.
your psychedelic experience.
Yeah. So
I mean, really, it's very Dionysian in so many ways,
yeah.
or
So
Dionysiac,
yeah.
as you said.
So I wrote my second book was called The Art of Losing Control, and that was about how people find ecstatic experiences in modern life. And there was a chapter in that about the psychedelics, and I went to Breaking Convention in 2015. And I was like, oh, there's this psychedelic renaissance going on. I was not part of psychedelic culture. I trip very, very, very rarely because I have to. Like I'm like it doesn't really agree with me. Um, but that got me. That was just one of the means to ecstatic experiences that I got interested in. I then edited a book about spiritual emergencies, some of which were psychedelic induced, some of which weren't. And then it was in 2021 really that, the psychedelic renaissance was taking off. There were suddenly these businesses. I was like, and, you know, just as it was just if you're interested in ecstatic experiences, it was a fascinating moment because it was going mainstream. I mean, it still is
It
fascinating.
still is. It still is.
You've got Bobby Kennedy, talking about psychedelics as probably the next Secretary of Health, and so it's just it's a I mean psychedelics is just it's an interesting blend of the spiritual and the mystical and magical, and the medical and the political and the occult, and the countercultural and military. So it's all these things, yeah. So, anyway, I suppose I remembered being 18 and not knowing what was going on and not finding any information. So I wanted to provide information for people in that same state. Um, uh, and so yeah, and then you get sucked in, and you start working on kind of psychedelic safety.
Are you sucked in right now?
And so and now I think where we're at now, this field is like um post euphoric wave, and then it's just like, okay, can we build systems? What would safe systems look like? And it's this kind of systems building grind.
It
uh,
is. Yeah, believe me.
yeah, it's less euphoric, less kind of like, here comes the golden age, or here comes the age of Aquarius. It's more like what qualifications do you need for a license and these kinds of things?
Right? There is reason for hope. There is a lot of research out there that gives us good reason, and I can see. Like I've even myself said, like I was shocked when I started looking at the research, uh, because I had no idea of the therapeutic benefits when I first came in. I always had that recreational mindset primarily. Same sort of story. And I had some challenging experiences, I only started, like, really integrating and thinking about them later, right? But it made so obvious sense, right? Maybe you could say a little bit about, you as a person, and I mean that in the sense of, like, you know, where are your origins in the literal sort of psychedelic source sort of context? What is your identification in terms of like land, people, country, communities, and where do you find yourself now?
My positionality.
Yes. I
Where's
can
my
use the big
positionality?
word. I know I can use the big words with you, but I try and make it accessible for everyone. But still,
Well, I'm English. I'm a Londoner, so I'm a kind of fifth generation Londoner,
wow.
from West London.
This generation, I
Right.
I don't think I've,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, before I had a kind of, I don't know. So, my, so all of my family are from Northern Europe, like Norway, Ireland, England, Normandy, Wales, and Scotland, yeah,
Yeah,
and Northern
no.
Ireland. So it's all from around there. Like my wife, she's from all these kinds of different places, like Spain, and an indigenous tribe in Costa Rica, and Jewish as well. And I'm like all concentrated around like the British Isles, and yeah,
The dart in the center of the
yeah, exactly. So no, nothing exotic. Yeah, and so, I don't know what else.
Well, maybe just to nod, like, what were, in London, since I can't speak for being a fifth generation Londoner, I have similar ancestry, but I've never even been to the UK. Judge me later. I saw an outline. But like what is the sort of orientation towards like plant medicines and psychedelics culturally even? Like when was you said you had your first psychedelic at 15, but I have at least the American perception that there's more homeopathy in Europe. A lot more herbal and medicinal friendliness. At least the EU for a long time even banned GMOs, right? And had more of a and like unlike the sort of general American, like let's just do it and see what happens, versus a sort of more let's wait and let's find research and evidence that's safe first type of idea. But what would you
Oh,
say
well,
to
you
the
asked me
Londoner
about my
mindset?
identity. So, like,
Ah,
psychedelics
well,
aren't central to my
I want it
identity.
all. I want it all. Why should it be
Like,
limited?
you're
I'm
assuming
white
it's
psychedelic. No,
central to
but
my identity.
I wanted your identity. In the sense of like how you choose to identify, because
So
I
tell me
think a
about
lot
your
of times.
identity. What psychedelic really matters to you?
No, I think it's complicated, right? This is the thing, right? Like
But that's interesting because I think for a lot of people in psychedelic culture, psychedelics are a big part of their identity.
that's right.
um, and of their spirituality and of their religion and stuff like psychedelics are not a big part of my identity. Like at the moment I work to support people who have post psychedelic difficulties, but they are not part of my spiritual practice. I haven't done psychedelics for like 5 years. So, yeah. So I wouldn't, when I think, if I think like, who am I? Psychedelics wouldn't, I mean, they would at the moment because I run this little NGO, but that's mainly to like support people, with post psychedelic difficulties. But I mean, in terms of your question about like plant medicine and Europe, I mean, that's a fascinating question. And here's what what I think is that the UK probably had, an indigenous druidic tradition,
Sure.
and in Wales particularly, and in
Absolutely.
Celtic.
And Celtic.
But and then it kind of disappeared, but there was magic. There was still kind of magic practices, like in the
We still are.
Elizabethan times and so
Yeah.
on. The magic was quite big, but all that time there were magic mushrooms in the UK, but there was nothing written about them. I mean, like, this is not, massively important for me, but
No,
this is
but I think even just saying the fact that it's not massively important for you is helpful to help delineate for people an orientation and relationship with you, right? That that
really.
that this isn't. No, I think so. I mean, some people might
Yeah,
assume.
no. This guy doesn't trip regularly.
I mean, I don't either, but I don't know what people are assuming. Just because I do psychedelic ethics doesn't mean I'm
Yeah.
on psychedelics all the time. I think
So,
that's a false assumption.
I mean, so you can go and pick magic mushrooms in the fields in the UK, and like I did when I was like 16. It was incredible. You just pick them in the fields and eat them, but that was only really discovered in the 70s
Yeah.
and became generally known in the 1970s, which is to me incredible that for thousands of years these were there, these visionary kinds of mushrooms, and there was no awareness of them, no mention of them. Like Shakespeare would talk about all kinds of things,
Yeah,
like
fairies. Let's go there.
fairies and
No?
mandrake and
Midsummer Night's
paragon.
Dream, all the
They
things.
didn't have any awareness of mushrooms, of magic mushrooms. So it's very it's very odd.
Yeah, it's interesting, especially given. I mean, we don't have to. I know we can easily wax philosophical, so I'll stop us from going there. But very tempting. But this is the thing, and something I guess as I try and figure out and integrate and reflect on, how do we create our new relationship? How do we have this sort of ecstatic, informed perspective, with the challenging experiences, with, cultures that, removed and actually, banned in various ways, at the very least, First Peoples, First Nations, including our own, right? Um, and that sort of that different kind of relationship with nature or altered states. Uh, what does it mean to kind of come into relationship with that now? And I mean, and I know that could be a whole
I don't
nother
know. I mean,
conversation.
I see psychedelics. Kind of mainly white people do it, right? I mean, like, like
Well, that's a real question. I mean,
psychedelic
like,
culture is
I think.
extremely white, and even like indigenous people don't particularly do psychedelics.
Well, I mean, you'd have to pick. I mean, first of all, we can't say that in a blanket concept, right? Because there's so many different communities of origin, right? And uh, I mean, even if we go to the Celtic origins, right, that would be our own origins. That there's some arguments to be made that there were, people were using plant medicines for altered states, right? Or just simply, um, or the Oracle of Delphi, and whether it's volcanic fumes or whether it was plants or a combination thereof, right? Altered states have been a part of, human and Western culture, but we haven't really embraced that
Yeah,
aspect.
I mean, so I live in Costa Rica, and like indigenous people here don't do psychedelics. It's wealthy Westerners come here and do psychedelics, and they kind of get the shamans to fly in, maybe.
Well, and that's definitely true. I mean, I actually know some people who had a peyote experience in Costa Rica just the other day, right? In Costa Rica, right? And like and the curandero, they weren't from Costa Rica. They weren't, and I think there's a lot of interesting complexities to go there. But maybe as we wrap up our conversation, and I want to, like, I could talk to you for hours for real, um one of the things I like to try and ask people in relation to this, into Psychedelic Source, part of the idea is to help build collaboration, build relationship, and help provide people different kinds of resources or sourcing for how to have either healthier experiences or grounded experiences. And you've already mentioned, your challenging experiences and the ecstatic integration. But if you could say, one thing now, if this is the only thing people hear and they hear it in like a little clip, what would be one piece of advice you would give someone who's curious about psychedelic experiences?
Do your research. Read about, you know, do your research about possible outcomes, the full range of them. Um, I would generally say, like, do a low dose with friends. I think it might, and maybe one friend is not is not on anything. It's just a kind of, sober sitter. Think about the days afterwards as well, like having good support if they're a bit kind of still in a somewhat altered state. So yeah, and there is an element of risk involved. I mean, some people have compared it to, like, extreme sports, or like, surfing maybe, or diving. And you wouldn't just go diving without doing a bit of research, and maybe even a bit of, some kind of preparations, and without some kind of briefing about,
Right.
how things.
Preparation,
Yeah.
education, or an experienced person, right?
And there are, eh, I mean, ecstatic experiences are not the be all and end all of life. They can be an escape from life. Um, yeah, and there are various ways to have these kinds of experiences, from, you know sports, to the arts, to nature, to things like, changing the way you breathe. So psychedelics is just one route, to these kinds of things. Um, and yeah, and they're definitely not the only way to get meaning in life. I mean, it would be sad if the only way to get meaning was to, take chemicals. So it's a route, but there are many routes, and it's a window to transcendence, but there are many avenues to transcendence. Um, so yeah, and then I would say, the usual. If you have a family history of bipolar or psychosis, there are probably better routes for you to, like, transcendent experiences.
Or at least, consider it, that part of your background as an additional risk factor that you're introducing, and prepare, for those potentialities. Um, well, I wanna give you a chance to give it on an ethics note, but I think that is an ethics note in and of itself. But any sort of final thoughts, or reflections? Like, what is your hope? Where's your
Yeah, look,
utopia?
I'm really hopeful for psychedelics. Like you said, um, you 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 come across miracle stories. They're not just hype.
They're not hype.
I've interviewed lots of people who said they were stuck in really bad, psychological problems, and psychedelics helped them turn the corner. So that's awesome. I think that they've got a real future, in the healthcare system. I know at least one pharmaceutical company who thinks they are the future of mental health treatments. Um, but they're not without risks. And I think we can learn about those risks, map them, and hopefully minimize them, and support people who experience, the kind of downsides. So I am hopeful for them. Of course, they're just one thing that's going on in this crazy world.
Yes, yes.
I'm not a utopian, but I do think they could make some aspects of life somewhat better, and that's
I
that's
agree.
good enough for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Jewel. I really appreciate you taking the time, and it's good to have another friend who's uh, doing the good education and ethical advocacy and fight in
Thank
the
you,
work.
Sandra. Thank you for all the work that you do.
I really enjoyed this episode with Jules, and getting to parry a little bit back and forth about a couple of different subjects, and it's great for me, not only as, like, an ethicist, but as an advocate who appreciates anyone who's doing similar advocacy work, but to see the impact that this work can really have in helping support people, and his work being able to provide resources and information for people who have challenging experiences, If you've had a challenging experience in the space, I really encourage you to check out the resource that he's the director of, the Challenging Experiences Project, and get connected to community, educate yourself, know that you're not alone. I think those are all brilliant takeaways. And whether you have a challenging experience or not, being more informed about this possibility as a part of ecstatic or psychedelic experiences that will not only help you be more informed, but will help to create a more safer community in which people can have these experiences and have better outcomes. And I just appreciate you for taking the time to listen to this episode of the Psychedelic Source. Thank you for joining me on Psychedelic Source. If you found value in today's episode, please subscribe wherever you get your podcast and share with others in our community. And if you're a psychedelic practitioner, therapist, or coach looking to identify blind spots in your practice or determine next steps for moving it forward, take the first step by visiting psychedelicsourcepodcast.com. Until next time, remember, start low, go slow, and stay connected to your source.